Stateless and now homeless as hundreds of thousands of Rohingya leave Myanmar, claims of ethnic cleansing. And the question, why isn't the nation's de facto leader doing anything about it? This is Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. A long-running conflict between an ethnic minority and a government that doesn't recognise them. To some, the Rohingya are illegal immigrants with no right to live in Myanmar. To others, they are a displaced and persecuted group that desperately needs help. Myanmar's state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi, has condemned human rights abuses, but she's been criticised for failing to do more.
All this has happened in 3 weeks. You have almost 500,000 people who have left, and the tragedies and the abuse that's happened there.
The humanitarian situation is catastrophic.
How important it is that real action is taken to de-escalate, to cease the violence.
And then this, after weeks of silence.
We condemn all human rights violations and unlawful violence. We are committed to the restoration of peace, stability, and rule of law throughout the state.
Condemned as a platitude, the international community expected something more substantial. More than 400,000 Rohingya have fled Myanmar. They say they are escaping rape, murder, arson, atrocities committed by the military, they claim. A security crackdown in Rakhine State. Witnesses talk of villages being burned, soldiers firing on civilians. Aid operations in Rakhine State are now in military hands. The government says it is rooting out terrorists, and the doors are closed to international observers.
I take this occasion to reiterate our request to the government of Myanmar for cooperation, most importantly by granting us access to the country.
Questions are being asked of the country's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Complex situation Aung San Suu Kyi finds herself in.
I don't know how much she can do.
Use that moral capital and that authority.
Her critics say her long silences and hesitance to condemn the military show her lack of real power. The world is bearing witness to Myanmar's internal divisions. And the roots of this bloodshed are buried deep. While there is little appetite for compromise, this tragedy on Myanmar's border can only continue.
Well, joining me from Thailand, we have Nyo On Mint. He's formerly a member of the National League for Democracy. He says the Rohingya are illegal immigrants. At the round table, we have Penny Green from the International State Crime Initiative. She says the Rohingya situation does amount to genocide. Also with us is Murad Qureshi, chairman of the Stop the War Coalition. He believes Bangladesh needs international support to deal with the influx of refugees. And Mark Farmaner, director of Burma Campaign UK, he says it's time for the international community to step in. Penny, if we could just start with you, what makes you think that this falls under the very serious category of genocide?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that genocide is a process. and that can take place over many years. And what we've witnessed with the Burmese state in relation to the Rohingya are a long series of mechanisms which have been designed to dehumanize, stigmatize, harass, isolate and weaken this community to the point where they have become entrapped in detention camps, entrapped in ghettos. Now they're fleeing for their lives, hundreds of thousands. And effectively, we have a situation where there are now more Rohingya on the Bangladeshi side of the border than there are inside Rakhine State.
We have No on Mint there chuckling away at your remarks about their problems. Nyo on Mint, do you deny there's genocide taking place there?
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I have a debate with Dr. Sani, who's a champion of the human rights and another, so-called Rohingya, the issue. But, that's allegations are very dangerous for the creation of Myanmar to be a very ultra nationalist, activities. Because, I don't see that any state sponsor, any government, like since 1948, there was no evidence that they have sponsored to terminate the so-called Rohingya community in northern Rakhine State.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, we conducted research in 2014 and 2015, which showed very clearly that the Myanmar state was, in fact, orchestrating and planning and conducting a genocidal campaign against the Rohingya.
Mark Farmer.
Do you have any...
I think what we've seen for decades now is governments and military in Burma. They've pursued a twin-track policy of trying to use deliberate impoverishment and human rights violations to drive the Rohingya people out of Burma. We saw an acceleration of this in 2012 when reform processes began there. A military-backed political party led by a former general, Thein Sein, was facing an election where he knew he'd be wiped out by Aung San Suu Kyi and her party. And he tried to whip up Buddhist nationalism and prejudice against the Rohingya to try and build personal support. So we've seen an acceleration of this process of oppression of the Rohingya there. And now Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the military, has taken it to a whole new level, driving out more than half the Rohingya population.
What do you think of the opinion there from Thailand? There's no evidence. Well, you're looking from a Bangladesh.
Yeah, indeed, because, I mean, let me get it clear. Whilst I am chair of Stop the War, I'm here in the personal capacity. I am Bengali. I go back to Bangladesh annually. I keep in touch with what my relatives and friends there say. I've got some idea of Chittagong and Cox's Bazar.
It must be pretty shocking to you.
It is. I mean, quite honestly, we had already 500,000 Rohingyas in Bangladesh before this recent push. They've come in desperation. At the time that they've come recently to Bangladesh, actually a third of Bangladesh was underwater. You can imagine what the priority of the Bangladeshi state was in those circumstances. And there are also similar tensions in the Chittagong hill tracts. Thankfully, the Bangladesh government has at least taken on board some of the health concerns of the kids, predominantly a major element of the victims of the Rohingyas that have come over.
What would you say to No on Mint when he says there is no evidence? I mean, surely people wouldn't be coming to Bangladesh in such a difficult circumstances if there wasn't an enormous pressure on them.
Indeed, and I think it will be outrageous if the Burmese, the Myanmar state gets away with pushing out 1 million Rohingyas, as has been clearly the state's policy for some time. I think actually, if you look at Suu Kyi, for example, she's only doing what her father was doing in '47, which when he didn't even recognise them. There are many minority groups in Myanmar which have been acknowledged and accepted and what have you, and unfortunately, the political leaders and the military have gone along with the Buddhist hate preachers, and for example, making Bengali a derogatory term. That's the thing that's really gone ping.
Actually, you mentioned her. No on Mint, you were formerly a member of Aung San Suu Kyi's party. How is it that a woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize and was highly admired around the world is now becoming the villain of this peace?
I don't think there was not very, fair treatment, and I don't know why that we are watching that the very like a C-class Hollywood movie, and then allegations and accusations, and everywhere, then I do not understand why they are hiding that the ASA, which is the terrorist group who killed the police stations and who, recruited the villagers. And then, you said that the 500,000, it's the Rohingya, so-called Rohingya, cross the border and refuge in Bangladesh. But I was, wondering that why the more than 50% of the more than 200 villages are still protected by the military, police, and the government. If genocide, and then that should have.
Is he saying that the villages were protected by the military? I mean, that's an extraordinary claim. That's an utterly extraordinary claim. The military have been burning the villages down to the ground, razing them, creating an environment in which the Rohingya can no longer live. It was already a hostile environment for the Rohingya.
Are you supporting the terrorist groups who killed? And then, today they found the 28 bodies of the Hindu villages.
Right, just to be clear, Penny, for our viewers at home, this is perhaps getting a little bit densely packed here. We're now talking about a terrorist group.
The Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army led 2 attacks in the past year or so, in October 2016 and more recently on the 25th of August this year. They are a small band. They claim that they have formed in response to the Burmese state's persecution of the Rohingya. And the evidence is that that is in fact what they are. But we know very little about them. The Burmese state has used the ASA attacks, where a small number of security forces were killed, as a pretext for the collective punishment of the whole of the Rohingya population. So we have thousands killed by the Burmese military in response, and over 420,000 have fled to join the already existing 500 to 700,000 Rohingya who have fled previous pogroms.
I think one of the problems here is there were these attacks on the police stations, and I think actually the actions of the military and the government have undermined their efforts to try and find out who carried out these attacks. They're actually hurting Rakhine and Hindu people who the military and government are claiming to defend, because by targeting all Rohingya indiscriminately, even children, and driving out 500,000 people, of course the international attention is going to be on those atrocities. And in the meantime, there are Rakhine and Hindu and others who have suffered. But they won't let the media go there to verify things, and the government have been lying. So my organisation, we try to work with the Rakhine organisations to actually find out what ASA are doing to the civilians and verify that, yes, the organisation that carried out the attacks on the 25th of August. But none of them will work with us because we also support human rights for the Rohingya.
In your opinion, has been massively disproportionate.
Of course, I mean, it's deliberate targeting. I mean, only really in Burma are the facts being disputed now, because you've got this massive government and military propaganda action there. Around the world, we know. We've got independent media, we've got human rights experts who verified what's going on.
Let's go back to Thailand for a moment. Noah Mint, you're the only side, if you like, the counterbalance to this entire debate. When you say that the situation is being misreported, it is actually the Myanmar government that's preventing almost any reporting, certainly no unrestricted reporting at all.
The point of the government, who is the very new, less than 20 months in the government seat, and then they might not have the experience, and then because the government also hired the Dr. Kofi Annan, fact-finding commission last 9 months. And then, the Kofi Annan Commission reported on 25th, the same day the ASA and then, the militant recruited the villagers attacked the 30 military police stations and 1 military outpost. So the point is that because she wanted a very systematic and international standard, and then military doesn't have any, the extra, they cannot move. The military is only a defensive matter. That's why the government.
I think the thing is there's two governments. When we're talking about Burma, we need to explain the situation here is You have now, since last year, Aung San Suu Kyi leading a civilian-led government. But under the constitution, which was drafted by the military, she only has limited control. So she controls things the military don't care about, like health, education, agriculture, the economy.
That's not
but
true.
The military,
that's not true.
It is true. The military are independent.
Yes.
You know
No,
it's true.
Mark,
This is the constitution. The military are independent.
And the military
Military
control
to
the key
act alone.
ministries.
Are you telling me you believe Aung San Suu Kyi controls the military? You know that constitution means that she doesn't control the
I
military.
mean, the Constitution, no, you cannot read the Constitution. You do not understand. I'm a Myanmar citizen of Myanmar, and I know that the government, the military cannot act alone without the government.
Well, you're
because
making Aung San Suu Kyi
according to
look
the
worse then,
Constitution-
because that means that she's actually collaborating with this ethnic cleansing campaign.
Well, and I think that's true. I think that Aung San Suu Kyi has aligned herself throughout this whole process with the military. She has not once stood up against the atrocities committed by her military. So I think we have to look at her actions, not simply her words. And I would like to say that she has not been silent, as many people claim she's been silent. She has not been silent. Her actions have been very, very clear. She supports this genocide against the Rohingya. She called in diplomats, foreign diplomats, to her office and told them that they were not to use the term Rohingya, that instead these were people who lived in Rakhine State who believed in Islam. Her office has talked about fake news in response to the very clear evidence of the atrocities committed by the Burmese military. Her office has also said that is responsible for the flight of international aid organisations.
We have to look back to Thailand and see a former member of Aung San Suu Kyi's party. I mean, you appear to be taking this with great levity. I can't understand it, Noam Mint. Either Aung San Suu Kyi is silent and she's a backseat kind of partner, a second partner in all of this, or she's complicit and happy for all of this to go on. Which is it?
No, actually, she followed the international standard. And then also she controlled the international pressure. And then because, the Aung San Suu Kyi government suppressed the Buddhist nationalists, the ultra nationalists, she jailed, the outlawed the Mabata. This is how our Myanmar people feel that she is totally, in this case, in the so-called Rohingya case, she was very, fair to treat every citizen. And I do not agree that any allegations and accusations. Military also, they have a code of conduct. They have a rule of engagement.
Oh, you've been on the Thai-Burma border. You lived on the Thai-Burma border for years. You saw what the military did to the Karen and to the Shan and the Karenni, and they're doing the same to the Rohingya now. You know this.
I came back from Yangon 2 days ago because I got a meeting here. That's why, I'm talking to you from Thailand.
And the incredible thing here is, quite honestly, we have got civilian Burmese politicians defending the military, which also were acted on them for decades. You would have thought, which suppressed them. I find it incredible that now that they find themselves in government with the military, they're defending them and their actions. We know a lot of Asian militaries, the only thing they're good for is beating up their civilians. And one thing I do want to see is the end of arms exports and training from British authorities and other authorities in Europe, because clearly that disables them considerably. And that's the most striking thing which we find. Bangladesh has had the same experience with the Bangladesh army. Many other civilian politicians have. On this occasion, they've not seen fit to be consistent with what they've had meshed out on them by their military.
Mark, you have sources on the ground and you're speaking to exiles. Just let's just round off this part of the debate on Aung San Suu Kyi. What happened? She's gone from being a hero, democracy icon, to being somebody, well, in many people's eyes, someone who's willing to perpetrate ethnic cleansing.
Well, she's been forced into a position where she has to compromise with the military in the current system that they've created. But that doesn't force her to be sort of defending the military to the degree that she does. She might not control them, but she doesn't have to act as a cheerleader for them. And there's been other decisions which have been very strange. She's kept political prisoners in jail since she's been in government. She kept in place, yes, and she's kept in place restrictions on aid to the Rohingya after she took power, which has resulted in the deaths of children and immense suffering as well. So Yeom is right, she created this Rakhine Commission chaired by Kofi Annan, which was making some long-term recommendations, although she made sure its mandate didn't cover any human rights issues. But in the meantime, you don't need a year-long commission to tell you that restricting aid to people in camps who are dependent on aid, where children are dying, is wrong. Right. So some of it is, it's just inexplicable.
Let's focus on Bangladesh now, bearing the brunt of helping the people who are fleeing. Tell us, what is it like there?
Well, I mean, for example, last week was a very critical week. There was the General Assembly, and Sheikh Hasina did raise this issue.
The leader of
Bangladesh. And it sounds as though I think the UN will provide something like 200 odd million over the next 6 months. But now, this is going to be a very long-term problem. It's not going to go away in 6 months' time. As I said earlier, we already have 500,000 Rohingyas in the state of Bangladesh. And actually, it will test the patience, no doubt, of Bengalis there. Particularly,
can they cope? I mean,
like I said, exactly, precisely. I mean, as I said earlier, actually, the time at which they were fleeing into Bangladesh, actually, a third of the country was underwater. You can understand what the Bangladesh states prior to
Bangladesh's leaders' attitude towards the Rohingya. At one point, she was taking quite a hardline stance against them, and perhaps preventing them to even enter.
Yeah. I mean,
how did the change come about?
Well, I think it's interesting. Those of us in the diaspora further out are quite happy to say if they're going to insult us as Bengalis, then we are all Rohingyas, quite honestly. And that's what's happened in the propaganda that they've put out. Those Bangladeshis there, I mean, we have got issues in Chittagong hill treks already. We've got tribal communities there who have had pressures from Bangladeshi settlers from the other side. So they're getting compounded on both fronts. That has to be dealt with. And I think there will be concerns about eventually Rohingyas moving into Dhaka and what have you. That will happen in time, undoubtedly. We've got to remember, in 91, 92, the two countries almost came to war over this. The only reason Bangladesh came back from that, it was persuaded not to.
Okay. Let's move on to some...
When the attention moves away after these kind of crises, the Bangladesh does impose some quite severe restrictions as well. And so most of the Rohingya that are in Bangladesh are not officially recognised. They're not receiving... so the government of Bangladesh believes that if it allows decent conditions in the refugee camps, more Rohingya will come.
Actually, you should blame the British colonial government who recklessly brought into the Myanmar with the Muslim community. I'm really, really sorry for them.
Do you think that justifies an ethnic cleansing campaign, even if the Rohingya only arrived during colonial times, regardless of the fact that Burmese kings claimed Bangladesh as part of Burma? Do you think that justifies ethnic cleansing?
The British government should not act like in 1826 to, to colonize Myanmar.
You got rights and protection when you were in exile in Thailand. After just a few years, many Burmese in the UK have rights and protection. How many centuries do Rohingya have to be in Burma before they should...
No, Unmint, just a moment, no, Unmint, the question really here that we want answered before we get to our final thoughts is, how long do the Rohingya have to live in Myanmar to be granted equal status?
That's everyone. I'm a Mon. I'm not a Burman. And then, we have like a three generations. So I have no problem with that. You call it the Rohingya, we call it the Bengalis. And then these people have documented and then getting awarded it's a citizenship. So there was no problem.
Yes,
the problem is that the illegal immigrants who are not, that Myanmar is not the final destination. They wanted to go for the better life. Last 20 years ago, they crossed the border in Thailand, Malaysia, you name it.
I mean, the Rohingya have a very, very long history inside Myanmar. It's an established and proven history. And as the point that Mark raised earlier, is it justifiable that if they've only been there for 2 generations, you can commit genocide against them?
Let me ask you, because we're really running out of time now, for your thoughts on the international community and the future of this crisis. Penny.
Well, I think the international community have done very, very little, in fact. It's quite appalling that things have got to this stage.
And the prognosis for the next few months, years?
Well, I would like to see a global arms embargo. I would like to see visa restrictions placed on Myanmar politicians like Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD cohort. And I think that we have to press very hard, and of course on the military. So I think we have to press very hard on these kind of sanctions and restrictions.
Mark, do you think the international community will act in this way?
Well, it's a month on and there's no practical action still, apart from the UK cancelling military training programme. The international community's done nothing. It stood by and allowed this to happen. So I hope they will act. I hope that they will do the targeted sanctions, but it can't just be a slap on the wrist measure because there's pressure now. What we need is a real strategy to put pressure on the military to stop treating, not just against what they're doing against the Rohingya, but other minorities in the country, stop obstructing democratic reform in the country.
Well, Mark Farmaner and Murad Qureshi, Nyo on Mint and Penny Green, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Roundtable today. Thank you. Well, the Rohingya crisis is often talked about, but not acted upon. But perhaps this latest round of violence will see the international community intervene, at least in a humanitarian capacity. That was Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Thank you for watching as ever.